David Staples here from the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here to do both a little bit of fact checking and reality checking in terms of Alberta politics today. I'm looking at whenever the NDP starts to really go after Jason Kenney, Premier Jason Kenney, and the UCP on COVID policy, Kenney often fires back with the idea of how things would have gone had Rachel Notley and the NDP been in power. And he did so recently again in the Alberta legislature. And here's what he said after Notley had claimed that no jurisdiction on earth had done worse than Alberta. Kenney fired back and said, quote, "Here in Alberta, we have sought to take a balanced approach rather than the kind of punitive, hard lockdowns that the NDP have always coveted. They have always wanted to maintain a hard and continuous lockdown, indiscriminate violation of people's lives, their personal and professional lives. Their model for COVID policy is the state of Victoria in Australia, where they have rolled the military in to enforce stay-at-home orders for months on end," unquote. So Kenney is referencing the situation in Australia that had looked so good for such a long time with their COVID zero program, and then they had, like everyone else, hit hard by the Delta, and they realized COVID zero wasn't working. But for a time, they really did have extremely draconian policies in Australia. The same has been seen in New Zealand. So people are starting to see their policies in a new light, kind of endless lockdown and harsh restrictions. So of course, Kenney wants to paint the NDP as wanting to have turned Alberta into that kind of COVID authoritarian state during the pandemic. So I'm going to look at today. Let's fact check that and reality check it. Let's see if there's enough backing for that. So I went through Hansard as my main source on this because obviously if the NDP thinks so much of Australia and New Zealand, they're going to bring it up in debate. And it turns out they did a number of times. So let's just go through some of the comments and see if they align with Kenney's critique. On December 1st, 2020, and this is at Alberta's really its second wave, but its first big wave, when things got a bit out of hand in Alberta in terms of a COVID outbreak. Here's what Marlon Schmidt said of the NDPs and NDP MLA. Quote, "Australia is an ideological fellow traveler of federal Canadian Conservatives, yet they have taken an extremely different approach to manning COVID. It's a tremendous success. I was just looking at the COVID cases that were reported on Australia, Mr. Speaker, and I was astounded to see that nationwide, and I might remind members that Australia is a nation of about 30 million people. In Australia yesterday, they reported 8 new cases of COVID. 8. Compare that to the 1,733. We had more people die of COVID yesterday in this province than there were new cases reported in the entire nation of Australia because they have managed to successfully get the pandemic under control." On December 8th, 2020, again during this first major wave in Alberta, Lauren Dock, NDP MLA, had this to say, quote, "We saw the success of countries like New Zealand and Australia where they had tighter restrictions, and now they're reaping the rewards of those restrictions. We failed to learn those lessons," unquote. March 18th, 2021, and again we go to Marlon Schmidt of the NDP. Quote, "There are comparator jurisdictions that have done a much better job of managing the COVID-19 crisis and, as a result, have much better economic prospects than our province does. One need only look at Australia and New Zealand. They have almost 0 cases of COVID currently. Their economies are set to rebound. In fact, they already have." April 14th, 2021, and we have Richard Feehan, NDP MLA, speaking out. Quote, "We have seen countries like New Zealand who made good, strong medical decisions, and as a result of those good, strong medical decisions have not suffered the ups and downs and the vagaries of this crisis that we have suffered here in this province," unquote. Finally, on June 14th, we go to Darren Billis, NDP MLA, who really is, I think, quite a strong member of the NDP in the House. Often is extremely sensible things to say. And what he said on that day was, quote, "The Alberta NDP called for moments in time for the government to take definitive action, similar to countries like Australia and New Zealand, who did take definitive action and actually reduced their case count to 0. What did we do here in Alberta? We had half measures, unquote. So I'm going to fact check Jason Kenney's essential critique that the NDP hankered at least, yearned at least, to do what Australia and New Zealand did as correct. It's a fair comment from Kenney. Billis comes close to saying, the closest to saying that the definitive action that the NDP wanted to take was similar, was like the definitive action taken in Australia and New Zealand. At the same time, I think we need to go one step further than that, though, in terms of judging the NDP and do kind of a reality check on whether or not, if they had actually been in government, if Notley had been premier, they would have brought in such measures. And here's where I don't think that was likely in Alberta. For one thing, we're not islands in the middle of, nowhere from our perspective, isolated in the South Pacific. We are a province with deep connections to the United States, BC, Saskatchewan, all thriving economy dependent on trade, and much more difficult when you have that kind of trade, when you're landlocked, to limit COVID. So for practical reasons, I don't think it was going to happen. But leaders are also stuck with what their own populations will accept, meaning that measures that will go over well in Alberta would be seen as way too loose in New Zealand or Ontario, but would be rejected as far too strict in a place like Texas or Florida. This greatly limits the polity options in any one jurisdiction, meaning that even if Notley had been premier and had wanted to implement a strict COVID-0 lockdown, she would have been handcuffed by fierce anti-lockdown sentiment and non-compliance in Alberta. I don't think the people of Alberta would have put up with it. They wouldn't have stood for it. She would have realized it long before, in the build-up during the debate, that this just was a non-starter in Alberta. In the end, Kenney's COVID policy was something of a blend between what we saw in more cautious NDP British Columbia and freewheeling conservative Saskatchewan. And I strongly suspect that in the end, Notley's COVID policy would have been similar, perhaps leaning more to the BC approach, given how unpopular restrictions are with many Albertans, but not all the way towards what BC did, a little bit more like Saskatchewan. And just like Kenney was bringing up, and Hinshaw were bringing up constantly, we were kind of doing what BC did. I suspect Notley would be saying, we're kind of doing what Saskatchewan did, to gain credence, to gain credibility for and license for the policies she was bringing in. So, in the end, my reality check on this is that if she had been premier, Notley's COVID policy would have been more like Kenney's policy than anything we saw in New Zealand or in Australia. Thanks.